when an unexpected act of kindness brings a retired professor and a struggling young mother together. What seemed like a simple gesture turns into a story filled with lies, twists, and a dangerous millionaire from the past who will stop at nothing to destroy their lives. Edward lived a life defined by silence and routine. Every morning, he followed the same ritual, waking up before dawn, brewing a strong cup of coffee, and sitting by the window in his book-filled living room. The morning light illuminated the overstuffed shelves, revealing what he considered his fortress, a place where he could hide from the outside world. Since losing Mary, his wife of many decades, Edward found solace in literature, but even his favorite stories were beginning to feel hollow against the backdrop of his solitude. His house was a museum of memories. Every corner held something that belonged to Mary: a forgotten scarf, a dusty photo frame, a hastily written note he could never bring himself to throw away. He tried to maintain the house meticulously, but there was an emotional disarray he could never quite organize. It was as though he was living in a space suspended in time, where every detail demanded attention while simultaneously suffocating his chances of moving forward. Loneliness was an old companion Edward knew well, but that didn't make it any less heavy. Occasionally, he ventured out to the local cafe, where he always ordered the same black coffee and sat at a discreet table. He enjoyed watching people, families, hurried youths, elderly friends chatting, but he never engaged. Being an observer of life was enough, though there was a flicker in his eyes that betrayed a longing to be part of it again. Books were his silent confidants and his captors. He read and reread the same stories, finding comfort in their familiarity, but also feeling trapped by them. No matter how deeply he immersed himself in the narratives, the emptiness he felt since Mary's death never eased. Sometimes, he wondered if he was destined to live this way, surrounded by words written by others, never crafting any new ones of his own. Yet, beneath his predictable life, a restlessness stirred. Edward knew his life was stagnant, but the thought of change was terrifying. Loneliness, though painful, felt safe. Engaging with the world meant risking more loss, and he wasn't sure he could endure that again. But life, as he was about to discover, had other plans. One seemingly ordinary morning, Edward felt an inexplicable urge to leave the house earlier than usual. He walked to the cafe, as always, but this time chose a different table closer to the counter. The change seemed small but was the first sign that something was about to shift. Little did he know, this simple decision would set the stage for an encounter that would transform his life in unimaginable ways. When Edward saw Sarah for the first time, he didn't know her name, her story, or why she seemed so desperate. All he saw was a young mother, struggling to control two small children while counting the coins in her wallet. The scene stirred something inside him that he couldn't quite explain, as though a part of him was awakening after years of dormancy. As he watched Sarah, Edward felt an impulse he couldn't ignore. He knew it wasn't his place to intervene. He could have simply finished his coffee and left, as he always did. But there was something about her and the two children that made him pause. For the first time in years, he felt the need to act, not out of obligation, but because it was the right thing to do. He approached the counter just as Sarah, visibly embarrassed, was trying to explain that she didn't have enough money to pay the bill. Without a second thought, Edward handed his card to the cashier and asked them to cover her meal. Sarah looked at him with a mix of gratitude and suspicion, as if she couldn't believe the gesture. Edward simply smiled, saying nothing. He had no idea that this simple act would be the beginning of a story full of challenges, secrets, and, above all, twists that would change their lives forever. The days following the encounter at the cafe were like any other in Edward's life: quiet, predictable, and filled with the sound of turning pages and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. He didn't expect to hear from the young mother or her children again. To him, what he had done was nothing more than a small act of kindness, or so he told himself. But deep down, he knew there was something about the woman that lingered in his mind. Then the phone rang. On the other end of the line was a hesitant, almost timid voice. "Mr. Edward?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly, and he recognized it immediately. She thanked him again for his gesture and, with a lump in her throat, explained her situation. She and her daughters had been evicted and were now living in a shelter with no clear path forward. There was desperation in her tone, but it was laced with dignity, as if she hated asking for help but had no other choice. Edward listened silently as Sarah detailed her circumstances. Each word weighed heavy with pain and exhaustion, resonating with him in ways he didn't fully understand. He wasn't the kind of man to get involved in others' problems, but the image of her and the two children at the cafe kept flashing in his mind. He wanted to help her, but the idea of opening his carefully controlled life to someone else terrified him. After the call ended, Edward sat in his favorite armchair, the one where he spent countless afternoons reading. The phone was still in his hand, but he couldn't focus on the books around him. Sarah's story unsettled him in ways he couldn't ignore. He began to wonder why her situation had affected him so deeply. It wasn't just her hardship, there was something more profound, something that tugged at an old wound within him. For hours he mulled over what to do. Part of him wanted to disconnect entirely, return to his routine, and pretend nothing had happened. But another part, stronger and more persistent, told him he couldn't ignore what he had heard. He didn't know why, but he felt as though fate had placed him in that cafe at that exact moment to cross paths with Sarah. The next morning, Edward made a decision. He picked up the phone and called Sarah back. Their conversation was brief but charged with emotion. He offered to help, though he wasn't entirely sure what that would entail. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, clearly astonished. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he replied, surprised by the words as they left his mouth. Edward began preparing his home, even though he wasn't sure if he was ready to share his space with Sarah and her daughters. The thought made him anxious, but there was also a spark of excitement he hadn't felt in years. He started reorganizing the guest room, dusting off furniture, and thinking about what the children might need. It was as if he were rediscovering a part of himself that had been dormant. Meanwhile, Sarah wrestled with her own doubts. Accepting Edward's help felt like a relief, but also an invasion of her independence. She had always managed on her own, carrying the weight of her decisions without relying on anyone else. But the exhaustion, the constant worry for her daughters, and the lack of options left her with little choice. There was something in Edward's voice, a sincerity, that made her believe he genuinely cared. The meeting between them was set. Edward questioned himself countless times, wondering if he was making a mistake. But every time doubt crept in, he remembered Sarah's expression at the cafe, a look that silently pleaded for help. He knew there was no turning back now. Something was about to change, and deep down, he felt it was a path worth taking. When Sarah arrived at Edward's house with her two daughters clutching her hands, hesitation filled the air. Edward watched as the small family stepped inside, carrying their few belongings, and he questioned his decision. His home, a sanctuary of solitude for so long, would now be shared with strangers. The unease gnawed at him. What if he wasn't ready for this? What if this gesture only complicated his carefully maintained life? Sarah, too, battled her own doubts. Accepting Edward's help was a relief but also felt like a surrender. She had always been self-reliant, priding herself on managing alone, and now she was moving into the home of a man she barely knew. Each room Edward showed her reminded her of what she had lost. Despite his kindness, an underlying discomfort lingered. Yet her daughters, unaware of the tension, explored the house with wide-eyed curiosity. That first night was fraught with silence. Edward retreated to his library, the space where he felt most in control, while Sarah tried to settle into the guest room, organizing their sparse belongings. They both wrestled with the weight of their decisions. Edward glanced at the familiar rows of books surrounding him, seeking solace in their presence, but his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of children's laughter from down the hall. He wasn't used to sharing his space, and the disruption stirred an unsettling mix of emotions. Sarah, lying awake, was overcome with feelings of inadequacy. She didn't want to depend on anyone, least of all a man she barely knew. But when she looked at her daughters, peacefully asleep for the first time in days, she knew she had made the right choice, no matter how difficult it was. The walls of Edward's home, filled with history and stability, offered them a safety she couldn't provide on her own. Edward struggled to sleep that night, haunted by the image of Sarah at the cafe. Her quiet desperation had struck something deep within him. He recognized her strength but also saw her exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying too much for too long. He questioned whether he could truly help or if he was in over his head. Yet, every time doubt crept in, he reminded himself of why he had acted in the first place. In the days that followed, an unspoken tension settled in the house. Edward continued his morning routines, but now his home was alive with sounds of children's footsteps and voices. Sarah, determined not to feel like a burden, took on household tasks, washing dishes, preparing meals, and tidying up. It was her way of contributing, though the feeling of intrusion lingered. Both tread carefully, as if navigating an invisible tightrope. One particularly difficult afternoon, Edward nearly gave in to his frustrations. The constant noise, the rearrangement of his space, it all felt overwhelming. But when he walked into the kitchen and saw Sarah teaching her daughters how to prepare a simple snack, something shifted. The sight of them together, laughing despite their circumstances, reminded him of the warmth his house had lacked for years. Slowly, his resistance began to wane. For Sarah, accepting Edward's help felt like a slow dismantling of her pride. But as the days passed, she noticed his unwavering support. He never made her feel judged or indebted. Instead, he quietly offered what he could, and that reliability allowed her to let her guard down, little by little. It was a fragile process, but one that planted the seeds of trust. Both Edward and Sarah were fighting internal battles. He struggled to let go of the control he had clung to for so long, while she grappled with the vulnerability of relying on someone else. Yet, they began to find moments of connection, small, quiet acts that spoke louder than words. It wasn't easy, but something was forming between them, a shared understanding that neither had expected. The road ahead was uncertain, and the shadows of Sarah's past still loomed large. But as Edward looked at the two young girls playing in the backyard, he realized that his life, once defined by solitude, had taken on a new dimension. Sarah, too, started to see that perhaps there was strength in leaning on someone else. Unknowingly, they were laying the foundation for a bond that would carry them through the challenges yet to come. Slowly but surely, the dynamic in Edward's house began to change. A man who had spent so many years avoiding deep connections now found himself drawn into the lives of Sarah and her daughters. One night, while preparing dinner, Edward heard the muffled sound of crying coming from Sarah's room. Without overthinking, he knocked softly on the door and asked if she needed anything. Her eyes, brimming with uncertainty, met his. "Just a little piece," she said with a faint smile. In that moment, Edward realized he had more to offer than just a roof and a bed. He started sharing pieces of his own story, memories of Mary, his late wife, his years as a teacher, and the challenges he had faced. The children, fascinated, would sit wide-eyed as he told stories before bedtime. Even Sarah, though initially hesitant, began to open up, sharing her struggles and the ever-present fear of William, her abusive ex-husband. These exchanges formed the first threads of a bond neither of them had anticipated. Edward saw in Sarah's daughters a glimpse of the joy he and Mary had once dreamed of experiencing. He and Mary had never had children, a quiet sorrow he had carried for years. Now, the sight of these two young girls exploring the house and asking endless questions filled him with a kind of pride he hadn't known before. It dawned on him that his role wasn't just as a host but as someone who could provide a sense of stability and care. One sunny morning, while Sarah helped the girls with their schoolwork, Edward had an idea. He brought out a stack of old children's books from his teaching days, long forgotten in a dusty corner of his library. "These were my students' favorites," he said, smiling as the girls eagerly flipped through the pages. That afternoon was filled with laughter and voices coming to life as stories were read aloud. For Edward, it was a moment of pure belonging he hadn't felt in years. Sarah began to see Edward in a new light. He wasn't just a kind man who had stepped in during a desperate moment. He was a mentor, someone who, through his patience and gentle guidance, was showing her that trust and kindness could still exist. Edward never judged her, even when she doubted herself. His unwavering presence became a source of strength she hadn't realized she needed. Their evening conversations became a cherished ritual. After the girls were asleep, Sarah and Edward would sit in the kitchen with cups of tea, talking late into the night. He would share memories of Mary, while Sarah opened up about the challenges of her past and the shadow that William still cast over her life. Edward listened with compassion, and in those quiet moments, he discovered that Sarah's courage was something he deeply admired. However, Edward wasn't without his own insecurities. He often wondered if he was doing enough or if he was even capable of helping Sarah in the long term. The fear of failing her and the children nagged at him, but those doubts would fade whenever Sarah thanked him or when the girls spontaneously hugged him. He realized that it wasn't about solving every problem, but about being present in the ways that mattered. One night, Sarah asked Edward why he had decided to help her. He paused for a moment before replying, "Because life has given me so much, and I think it's time to give something back." Sarah didn't respond immediately, but her grateful smile said everything. Edward held on to that moment, knowing it would stay with him as a reminder of why he had stepped out of his comfort zone. The children, with their boundless energy and innocent joy, were the glue that held everything together. They saw Edward as a figure of protection and trust, and their laughter became the soundtrack of his days. Sarah, seeing this bond, began to lower the walls she had built around herself. There was something about the way Edward cared for her daughters that made her believe, perhaps for the first time, that things could get better. Both Edward and Sarah understood that their lives had changed irrevocably. Edward was no longer the lonely man surrounded by books, and Sarah was no longer the woman running from her past. Though neither of them could predict what lay ahead, they began to feel that, together, they might just be strong enough to face it. Edward's decision to transform one of the rooms in his home into a space for Sarah and her daughters felt, at first, like a simple act of kindness. But as the days turned into weeks, he realized this was far more than rearranging furniture or offering a roof over their heads. His quiet, structured life was now a whirlwind of activity. The house, once silent and still, was alive with laughter, hurried footsteps, and the chatter of two curious little girls. Each sound reminded him that his life would never be the same. Determined to make the girls feel at home, Edward set to work turning the spare room into a haven just for them. He spent hours organizing shelves, choosing colorful bedding, and even hanging star-shaped lights on the ceiling. When the girls saw the room, their faces lit up with joy. For Edward, the look in their eyes made every effort worthwhile. He wasn't just providing shelter, he was creating a place where they could feel safe and cared for. Sarah, meanwhile, watched Edward's efforts with a mix of gratitude and unease. She wanted to do more to contribute, to prove to herself that she wasn't a burden. She took on household tasks, cleaning, cooking, and helping with small repairs, as her way of saying thank you. But even as she found ways to give back, the nagging fear of being an intrusion never fully left her. It was a delicate balance they were both trying to maintain. Edward began to notice how much his world had changed. His once meticulously tidy home now bore the marks of a bustling household. Children's drawings taped to the fridge, toys scattered in the living room, and the faint aroma of Sarah's cooking filling the air. It wasn't always easy for him to adjust. There were moments when he longed for the quiet, but he also couldn't deny the warmth that had returned to his home. Not everything came smoothly. Sarah carried the constant fear of William finding them, and that fear often seeped into the atmosphere. Edward noticed her jump at small noises or check the locks on the doors multiple times a day. He didn't press her, but he was quietly determined to protect her and the girls. That resolve became the foundation of his growing bond with them. Their relationship was built one small moment at a time. Edward found joy in the simplest things, helping the girls with their school projects, teaching them about his favorite books, and listening to their stories about the adventures they dreamed of. For Sarah, watching Edward connect with her daughters filled her with a bittersweet sense of relief. She had spent so long shouldering everything alone that allowing someone else to step in felt both comforting and terrifying. Edward began to realize that his role was more than just a host. He was becoming a stable figure in their lives, something he hadn't expected but found deeply fulfilling. One evening, as the girls sat cross-legged on the floor listening to one of his stories, one of them asked, "Will you always be here, Grandpa Ed?" The question hit him harder than he anticipated. Smiling, he replied, "As long as I can, I will." The challenges were not confined to their home. William's shadow loomed over them, a constant reminder of the fragility of their newfound stability. Edward started to think about what it would mean to confront that threat. He wasn't a man of action, but the thought of standing by while Sarah and her daughters faced danger was unbearable. The idea of doing more, of being more, began to take root in his mind. Even in the face of uncertainty, moments of joy and connection continued to grow. Edward found himself laughing more often, not just at the children's antics but at his own transformation. Sarah, too, began to feel a glimmer of hope. Though she was still adjusting to this new reality, the kindness and consistency of Edward's presence gave her strength. As their lives intertwined further, Edward and Sarah both sensed that the path they were on was one they could no longer turn back from. The threshold had been crossed, and though they didn't know what lay ahead, they felt a newfound confidence in each other. Together, they were stepping into a world neither had anticipated, one where challenges would come, but so too would the promise of healing and renewal. The fragile calm in Edward's house was shattered when Sarah received an anonymous phone call. The voice on the other end was all too familiar. It was William, her ex-husband. He had found her. Panic set in as Sarah struggled to stay composed while he made veiled threats, his words laced with malice. The fear she thought she had left behind resurfaced instantly. Edward noticed the change in her demeanor before she even spoke, and his resolve to help her only deepened. Edward knew this was more than he could handle alone. He contacted Rebecca, an old friend and a sharp attorney with an unwavering sense of justice. Rebecca listened intently as Edward explained Sarah's situation, and without hesitation, she offered her help. She began working with Sarah to gather evidence and build a case that would not only protect her and the children but also ensure William's manipulations were exposed. Rebecca became an essential ally, bringing hope and a clear path forward. Meanwhile, William was busy waging his own war. He spread lies around town, painting Sarah as an unstable mother who had irresponsibly fled with her children. These rumors reached Edward, who felt a simmering anger at William's attempts to manipulate the narrative. Still, Edward knew that this battle couldn't be fought with anger alone. With Rebecca's guidance, they focused on the facts, determined to build an unshakable case. Sarah faced tests of her own. Revisiting her past to gather evidence meant confronting painful memories she had tried to bury. Each piece of evidence, a document, a photograph, a testimony, felt like reopening a wound. But Sarah pushed through the pain, knowing this was her chance to free herself and her daughters from William's grasp. Edward watched her with quiet admiration, marveling at her strength even in the face of such emotional weight. The tension took its toll on the entire household. Edward found himself questioning if he was truly equipped to help Sarah through this storm. He wasn't a fighter, nor a man of action. He was just a retired professor who had stumbled into their lives. But every time doubt crept in, he reminded himself that his role wasn't to solve everything but to provide stability and care. That alone, he realized, could make all the difference. The children, blissfully unaware of the full scope of the situation, sensed the tension in their mother and Edward. To protect them, Edward went out of his way to create moments of joy. He invented games, read them stories, and spent hours in the backyard helping them build a makeshift playhouse. Their laughter was a welcome reprieve, a reminder that life still had light in the darkest of times. Rebecca, the unyielding advocate, worked tirelessly behind the scenes. She uncovered key evidence that painted a damning picture of William's abusive behavior. One particularly crucial piece was a recording that left no doubt about his threats. When Sarah first heard it, she froze, overwhelmed by the weight of her reality. Edward was there, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's hard, but this is what we need," he said softly, his words grounding her in the moment. William's threats didn't stop at phone calls. One night, he appeared at Edward's house, pounding on the door. The confrontation was tense, but Edward stood firm. Though his heart pounded, he made it clear that Sarah and her daughters were under his protection and that he wouldn't back down. It was a moment of fear but also of strength, as Edward realized he was no longer the passive man he once was. The mounting evidence gave Sarah a renewed sense of purpose. She worked closely with Rebecca, preparing for the inevitable legal battle. Edward, always nearby, provided a quiet but steadfast presence. The bond between them grew stronger, built not on grand gestures but on shared determination and trust. They were becoming a team in every sense of the word. Even with William's looming presence, glimmers of hope began to emerge. Every piece of evidence collected, every step forward in the case, felt like a small victory. Edward saw the strength in Sarah's eyes and the resilience in her daughter's laughter. He began to believe that, together, they could overcome even the darkest of challenges. And though the battle was far from over, they all felt the tide beginning to turn. The weeks that followed were intense. Edward's home, once a refuge of peace, had become the epicenter of a quiet but relentless battle. Sarah and Rebecca spent hours in the dining room, which now looked more like a command center. Stacks of documents, photographs, and notes covered the table. Edward observed from a distance, sensing the weight of their work. They were nearing something crucial, something that could change everything. One rainy afternoon, Rebecca uncovered a pivotal piece of evidence. A recording from a former acquaintance of William's that captured his abusive behavior. Sarah froze when she heard it, the memories flooding back like a tidal wave. The pain was sharp, but this time she wasn't alone. Edward placed a firm hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "It's hard," he said gently, "but this could be what finally frees you." Edward, too, wrestled with his fears. He was a man who had built his life on quiet consistency, but now he was standing on unfamiliar ground. The danger posed by William was real, and the weight of protecting Sarah and the girls felt overwhelming. Yet, every time he considered retreating, he thought of the family they had become. He wasn't just a bystander, he was part of their fight now. For Sarah, the approach to the courtroom felt like descending into a dark, suffocating cave. Sorting through evidence meant revisiting years of pain she had desperately tried to forget. But this time, instead of breaking her, it fueled her determination. Every document she filed, every detail she reviewed, was a step closer to reclaiming her life. Edward watched her with awe, seeing a strength in her that inspired him in ways he couldn't articulate. The girls, though shielded from the worst of the situation, could sense the tension in the air. Edward took it upon himself to create moments of lightness for them. He spent hours in the library with the girls, reading stories and inventing games that transported them to worlds far removed from the one they were living in. Their laughter became a kind of armor, a reminder of what they were all fighting for. Rebecca, ever the professional, was becoming personally invested in their fight. "We're close," she told Edward one evening. "This is the kind of case that can't be ignored." Edward nodded, grateful for her resolve. She wasn't just an ally, she was their anchor, keeping them focused as the stakes continued to rise. The house was filled with a mix of tension and hope. Every piece of evidence they unearthed brought them closer to the inevitable confrontation. Edward found himself taking on small tasks, making sure the house was in order, preparing meals, and creating a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. He knew these gestures were small, but they felt significant in maintaining a sense of stability for Sarah and the girls. Sarah began writing her personal testimony, a task that was as cathartic as it was painful. She worked late into the night, often pausing to catch her breath as tears blurred her vision. Edward would quietly read over her shoulder, offering words of encouragement when she faltered. "You're stronger than you think," he reminded her. Slowly but surely, she began to believe it. The closer they got to their day in court, the more they felt the gravity of what they were about to face. William's presence loomed large in their minds, but so did the growing sense that they had a real chance at victory. Rebecca's meticulous preparation and Sarah's unyielding determination were shaping a case that would be hard to dispute. Edward, who had spent so many years living in the past, realized he had become fully immersed in the present. The fight was no longer just Sarah's, it was theirs. And while he didn't know what the outcome would be, he was certain of one thing: he would stand by them every step of the way. The courtroom awaited, and with it, the moment that would determine their future. As they prepared for what lay ahead, they clung to the hope that their collective strength would be enough to face whatever came next. The day of the trial arrived, and the air was thick with tension. Sarah sat in the courthouse waiting area, holding her daughter's hands tightly. Edward was by her side, his presence steady and reassuring despite his own nerves. Rebecca, armed with a stack of evidence and an unwavering focus, paced the room, reviewing every detail one last time. They had prepared for this moment, but the weight of what was at stake was undeniable. It was time to confront William and fight for the future they all believed in. When William entered the courtroom, Sarah's breath caught. He carried the same arrogant demeanor she remembered, his smirk a deliberate attempt to unnerve her. Edward noticed her discomfort and leaned in. "He doesn't hold power over you anymore," he whispered. His words sparked a flicker of strength within her. She nodded, steeling herself for what was about to unfold. The trial was grueling. William, with his polished appearance and rehearsed lies, worked to dismantle Sarah's credibility. He presented false witnesses and wove manipulative narratives to paint himself as a victim. Edward clenched his fists as he listened, his anger barely contained. But Rebecca, calm and methodical, countered every claim with precision, presenting irrefutable evidence that tore through William's fabrications. It was a battle of wits, every move critical. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She walked to the stand with hesitant steps, her hands trembling. At first, her voice wavered, but as she began recounting her story, it grew steadier, filled with a raw honesty that was impossible to ignore. She spoke of the years of abuse, the fear she endured, and the sacrifices she made to protect her daughters. Edward watched her, tears welling in his eyes. This wasn't just a testimony, it was a declaration of resilience. William interrupted several times, attempting to discredit her, but the judge silenced him each time. Sarah pressed on, her voice unwavering as she detailed the reality of her life with William. Rebecca supplemented her testimony with hard evidence, including the recordings that exposed his threats. The turning point came when the recordings were played in court, stripping away any doubt about William's true nature. For the first time, his confident facade cracked. Edward couldn't take his eyes off Sarah as she testified. He had always admired her strength, but seeing her stand up and reclaim her voice moved him deeply. This was the woman he had come to care for, a mother, a fighter, someone who refused to let her past define her. The bond between them felt unspoken but undeniable. He realized then that his role in this fight wasn't just about support, it was about believing in her even when she doubted herself. The most intense moment came when William took the stand. His attempts to charm and manipulate the courtroom fell flat against the mountain of evidence Rebecca had built. His lies unraveled, and every denial was met with irrefutable proof. The courtroom felt charged, as if everyone present could sense that justice was within reach. For the first time, William appeared unsure, his confidence giving way to frustration. The hours dragged on, but finally, the judge delivered the verdict. Sarah was granted full custody of her daughters, and a restraining order was issued against William. As the words were spoken, Sarah's tears flowed freely. Edward reached for her hand and held it tightly, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured together. They had won, not just in court but in reclaiming their lives. William left the courtroom with his usual smirk, but it was hollow, his defeat evident in his body language. Sarah watched him go, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. She knew the scars he had left would take time to heal, but she also knew she had taken the first step toward freedom. Edward, sensing her emotions, gave her a reassuring look. "You did it," he said softly. "You gave your daughters the life they deserve." As they left the courthouse, the weight of the trial began to lift. Rebecca placed a hand on Edward's shoulder and said, "You've done more for them than you realize." Edward nodded, his emotions too overwhelming to express in words. The fight had been long and grueling, but for the first time in years, they all felt the promise of a brighter future. For Sarah, the victory was bittersweet. The fight wasn't over, there were still pieces to pick up and a life to rebuild. But as she looked at her daughters, their faces glowing with joy, she knew it had all been worth it. Edward, walking beside them, felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Together, they had faced the storm, and together, they were ready to embrace the calm that followed. After the trial, Edward's house felt transformed. It wasn't just the physical space but the energy within it. What had once been a quiet, lonely refuge was now filled with warmth and laughter. Sarah, with full custody of her daughters, finally allowed herself moments of peace. The looming threat of William had been replaced by a cautious hope. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt she was on solid ground. The girls had started calling Edward Grandpa Ed, a nickname that both surprised and delighted him. He took on the role with enthusiasm, teaching them how to tend the garden he and Mary had once cherished. Afternoons in the yard became a cherished ritual, planting flowers, chasing butterflies, and telling stories. Each moment with them reminded Edward of the joy he thought he'd lost forever. They gave his days a renewed sense of purpose. Sarah, too, was flourishing. With Rebecca's help, she secured a job at a small local business. The work was steady and fulfilling, offering her not just financial independence but also a sense of pride. For years, she had been defined by survival, but now she was beginning to define herself on her own terms. Edward watched her transformation with quiet admiration, proud of the strength she didn't always see in herself. Rebecca remained a close part of their lives, visiting often for coffee and long conversations around the dining table. Her friendship with Sarah deepened, and the two began discussing Sarah's future plans. These talks were filled with excitement and possibility, a stark contrast to the fear and uncertainty that had dominated Sarah's life before. Edward, listening from his seat at the table, felt a quiet contentment seeing Sarah look ahead with hope. Edward's own life had taken on a new vibrancy. His mornings, once solitary, were now shared with the sounds of children's laughter and Sarah's voice in the kitchen. He found joy in small projects around the house, fixing up the girls' room, building a treehouse in the backyard, or organizing his library to make room for new additions. Each task was a way to show his care, to contribute to the life they were building together. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Sarah turned to Edward and said, "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for everything you've done." Edward shook his head with a gentle smile. "You've already repaid me," he replied, glancing at the girls who were giggling over a book in the corner. "You've brought life back into this house." The girls had settled into their new routine, thriving in school and making friends. They brought home stories of their adventures, their laughter filling the spaces that had once been marked by silence. Edward adored these moments, finding himself drawn into their world of imagination and wonder. The house, now alive with their voices, was a testament to how far they had all come. Edward's library, once a place of solitude, became the heart of the home. The girls loved spending hours there, poring over books while Edward read aloud. It became a ritual that brought them all closer together, a way to share stories and create new memories. For Edward, it was a profound realization that his life had more chapters to write, and they would be shared with the people he now called family. Despite the victories, Edward knew the journey wasn't over. The future would bring its own challenges, but they were better equipped to face them together. The bond they had formed wasn't just born of necessity, it was a true connection that had grown from shared struggles and triumphs. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were thriving. For Edward, Sarah, and the girls, the reward wasn't just the freedom they had fought so hard for, it was the sense of belonging they had created. The house was no longer just a building, it was a home filled with love, resilience, and hope. And as Edward sat in his favorite chair, listening to the laughter that filled the room, he realized he had found something priceless, a reason to live fully again. With the courtroom battle behind them, Edward's home began to settle into a new rhythm. The silence that had once defined the space was now replaced by the hum of life, a life shared by people who had found solace in each other. The road back to normalcy wasn't just about the absence of fear, it was about rediscovering the joy in everyday moments. The once isolated house was now a home brimming with warmth, laughter, and connection. Edward started his mornings as he always had, with a steaming cup of coffee and a book in hand, but now he often had company. The girls would shuffle into the living room, sleepy-eyed but eager to join him. They'd bring their own books, sometimes children's stories, sometimes school assignments, and settle beside him. These mornings, once quiet and solitary, became a cherished ritual that made Edward feel more alive than he had in years. Sarah was also rebuilding her life. Her new job brought not only financial stability but a sense of self-worth. For the first time in years, she wasn't defined by survival or fear. Her confidence grew with each day, and she found herself dreaming about the future, something she hadn't dared to do in a long time. Watching her daughters thrive in their new environment reinforced her belief that she had made the right choices. The girls were blossoming in their new routine. Their laughter echoed through the house as they shared stories from school, proudly displayed their artwork, and ran through the backyard with boundless energy. Edward couldn't help but marvel at their resilience. He had taken on the role of Grandpa Ed with enthusiasm, delighting in their imaginative games and joining their playful antics whenever they asked. Sarah often found herself reflecting on how far they had come. The fear that William had instilled in her no longer loomed as it once did, though she knew there were still scars to heal. On quiet evenings, she and Edward would sit together and talk about their lives, past, present, and future. These conversations were a source of comfort for both of them, a reminder that they weren't navigating life's challenges alone. Edward, who had spent so many years anchored in memories of Mary, began to see his life in a new light. The house, once a museum of his grief, now felt alive. He still cherished Mary's memory, but he no longer felt trapped by it. Sarah had gently encouraged him to repurpose some of Mary's belongings, not to erase her, but to integrate her into the new life they were building. It was a gesture that brought Edward a sense of peace he hadn't expected. Rebecca remained a steadfast presence in their lives. She visited often, bringing updates on the community work she had become even more passionate about since helping Sarah. Her friendship with Sarah deepened, and the two began discussing ways they could help others in similar situations. Edward listened to their plans with quiet pride, knowing that what had started as a single act of kindness had grown into something far greater. Edward took on new projects around the house, from building a treehouse for the girls to tending the garden with Sarah. These activities were more than just chores. They were acts of love that solidified their bond as a family. He found himself looking forward to each day, no longer dreading the monotony that had once defined his life. Every task was imbued with a sense of purpose. Though life was brighter, the shadows of the past hadn't completely disappeared. Sarah occasionally had moments of doubt, flashes of fear that William might return. Edward was always there to reassure her, not with grand gestures but with his quiet, steady presence. Together, they reminded each other that while the road ahead might not always be smooth, they were no longer walking it alone. As the days turned into weeks, Edward realized that his life had taken on a new meaning. The house was no longer just his, it was theirs. The family they had created, built on trust and resilience, had given him a renewed sense of purpose. And though the journey back to peace wasn't without its challenges, they faced each day with gratitude for how far they had come. Edward's life, once steeped in silence and nostalgia, had been reborn in ways he could never have imagined. The house, once a shrine to the past, now buzzed with life. He no longer woke to a deafening quiet but to the soft patter of little feet and the smell of coffee Sarah brewed in the mornings. It was a subtle resurrection, one that turned grief into connection and solitude into joy. Sarah's transformation was equally profound. She no longer carried the weight of constant fear, though she knew the scars of her past wouldn't vanish overnight. Her newfound independence, coupled with the safety of Edward's home, allowed her to stand taller, smile wider, and dream bigger. She had gone from merely surviving to truly living, and in her daughter's laughter, she found daily reminders of why the fight had been worth it. Edward, who had spent years retreating into memories of Mary, began to let those memories breathe alongside his new reality. His mornings in the library were no longer solitary. Instead, they were filled with Sarah's daughters flipping through picture books or asking him about the stories he used to teach. The library, once a place of introspection, became the vibrant heart of their shared home. The bond between Edward and Sarah grew in quiet, meaningful ways. There were no grand declarations, just countless small gestures that spoke of mutual respect and understanding. Edward helped Sarah tend to the garden, and she taught him new recipes she'd learned over the years. Together, they wove a life built not on necessity but on choice, a partnership born of shared resilience and newfound trust. The girls, oblivious to the deeper emotional layers around them, were thriving. They called Edward Grandpa Ed with unreserved affection, and their laughter was the soundtrack to his days. He built them a treehouse in the backyard, a project that took weeks but filled him with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. Watching them climb and play reminded him that life's simplest joys often held the most profound meaning. Rebecca, still an integral part of their lives, often marveled at the changes in Edward. "You found a second chapter," she told him one evening over tea. Edward nodded but said nothing. He didn't need to explain. The warmth in his smile and the life bustling around him said it all. Rebecca's friendship with Sarah had also deepened, and together they began exploring ways to help other women find their own fresh starts. Edward's resurrection wasn't just about the life he had regained, it was about the purpose he had found. He realized that Mary would have been proud of the man he had become, of the way he had opened his home and heart to a family in need. He still honored her memory, but it no longer weighed him down. Instead, it propelled him forward, reminding him of the capacity for love that had always been a part of him. Sarah's resurrection was in her rediscovered sense of agency. For years, she had defined herself by her struggles, but now, she was shaping her future with intention. She saw the world through a lens of possibility, something she hadn't dared to do in years. The fear that William had instilled in her was still a shadow, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it became a testament to her strength, a reminder of what she had overcome. Together, Edward and Sarah realized they had built something extraordinary. It wasn't the traditional family either of them had envisioned, but it was a family nonetheless. Their home, once a place of isolation, was now a sanctuary of laughter, love, and hope. Each day brought new challenges, but also new reasons to celebrate the life they had created together. For Edward, Sarah, and the girls, resurrection wasn't about erasing the past. It was about embracing it, learning from it, and letting it inform a brighter future. They had faced their own versions of death, loss, fear, and hopelessness, and come out stronger on the other side. And as Edward sat in his favorite chair, listening to the girls giggle over a bedtime story, he knew that this was only the beginning of a life reborn. Edward's home had become a place of transformation, not just for Sarah and her daughters but for himself as well. The silence that had once defined his days was now replaced by the rhythm of a family's life, laughter echoing down the hallways, the hum of shared meals, and the quiet comfort of being surrounded by love. What began as a single act of kindness had blossomed into something far greater, a home filled with renewed purpose, connection, and hope. For Edward, the elixir was the life he never thought he'd live again. He had spent years consumed by grief and nostalgia, but Sarah and her daughters brought light into his world. His library, once a refuge of solitude, had become the heart of their home. Afternoons were spent reading stories aloud, the girls interrupting with questions or giggles, their enthusiasm infectious. Edward found himself rediscovering the joy of storytelling, not just through books but through the life they were creating together. Sarah's elixir was her newfound freedom and strength. The victory in court was a monumental step, but what came afterward was just as transformative. With her daughters safe and her life no longer under William's shadow, Sarah began to dream again. She found fulfillment in her work, and with Rebecca's encouragement, she started exploring ways to help other women in similar situations. Her past no longer defined her. Instead, it fueled her drive to create a better future. The girls were perhaps the purest embodiment of the elixir. They had gone from carrying the weight of fear to embracing the freedom of childhood. They filled the house with drawings, stories, and endless questions for Edward, whom they now called Grandpa Ed without hesitation. Their laughter and curiosity were contagious, reminding everyone around them of the resilience and boundless spirit of youth. Rebecca remained a steadfast friend and ally, often visiting to share updates on her work or simply to enjoy the lively atmosphere of Edward's home. She marveled at how much had changed, not just for Sarah and her daughters but for Edward as well. "This house feels alive," she remarked one evening, watching the girls chase each other through the living room. Edward nodded, his heart full. "It does, doesn't it?" Edward began taking on small but meaningful projects around the house. He built a tree house in the backyard for the girls, a space where their imaginations could run wild. He and Sarah started a garden together, planting flowers and vegetables that brought new life to the yard. These acts weren't just practical. They were symbols of growth, healing, and the life they were building together. One day, as they sat together in the library, one of the girls asked Edward, "Grandpa Ed, can we write a book about our stories?" The question took him by surprise, but it also touched something deep within him. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he replied with a smile. The thought of capturing their journey, of turning their struggles and triumphs into something lasting, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The road back wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments when Sarah's past tried to creep back into her thoughts, and Edward occasionally felt the weight of his own losses. But those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the strength they had found in each other. The family they had created was unconventional, but it was real, and it was theirs. The elixir they carried was not a single moment of triumph, but the culmination of their journey together. It was the realization that even after immense loss, fear, and struggle, life could be beautiful again. It was the laughter of the girls, the quiet conversations between Edward and Sarah, and the steady presence of Rebecca, always ready to lend a hand. As Edward sat on the porch one evening, watching Sarah and the girls play in the yard, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had found not just a second chance, but a new purpose, one that filled his days with meaning. The elixir they had all gained wasn't something tangible. It was the bond they shared, the life they had rebuilt together, and the hope that carried them forward.